If you're inside the world of motion graphics, visual effects, or CGI, you've probably run into a program like Houdini, and if you're anything like me, the first time you run into it, you end up running right back out of it. Houdini is known as being a very complicated, complex, alien, technically challenging program. That's probably the best way I could describe Houdini in a few words. My first time trying to use Houdini, I ended up probably spending about 30 minutes inside of it and just leaving feeling really discouraged. I felt like I wasn't smart enough, like I had reached my limit as an artist. At the time, I thought that the problem was with me. For beginners, a big part of learning Houdini is not necessarily the technical side, but it's the mental side. So I set a challenge for myself, and I said in 7 days, I'm going to learn Houdini for about like a few hours each day, and by the end of the 7 days, I'll have some kind of render or object or something that I think that is good enough to post and share out there into the world. I ended up making a procedural asteroid generator. By the way, if you're interested, the project file is below at my Patreon, along with weekly exclusive assets and videos. So if you want to support the channel, you can check that out. But anyways, I just really wanted to make this video for other artists out there that might be feeling inadequate or struggling to learn this program. It's not going to be an end-all tutorial in Houdini or anything like that. I just wanted to share some helpful tips and tricks, something to give you a little bit of success in the beginning of learning this very complex, confusing, and powerful program. Day one was mostly just spent, well, on the basics. No surprise there. How to move an object, how to create geometry. This is all kind of different inside Houdini. Also, I did put an emphasis on learning some of the quick hotkeys and commands and little tricks that you can do to speed up your workflow. One, for example, is typing in $F. You can animate parameters based on your frame rate or based on time, just depending on what variable you call into play. You can still animate the regular way also, just with keyframes, but this is something that's super nice that other programs like Cinema 4D don't offer, is kind of some basic coding language implemented and interacting with your UI. So after giving all that praise to Houdini, I do have to say there's one thing that really frustrated me and really annoyed me, and I felt like could have been implemented better, is installing third-party render engines. You actually have to dive into the Houdini program file and point Houdini towards your Octane and Redshift directories, which I wasn't even fully able to get Octane to work, which is a bummer because it's a very nice, fast spectral render engine, but Redshift was working, which was good. However, you'll see later on, I ended up just exporting everything as a Limbic because you'll figure out pretty fast that to do something inside Houdini, sometimes there's a lot more steps than to do something inside of Cinema 4D. After I played around with Redshift for a while, I decided to work up the courage and start jumping into some of the Houdini nodes. I started in the SOPs context. For those of you who don't know, that is surface operators, and I didn't know until I just looked it up. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying you can modify the geometry. It also sounds pretty cool. If you ever want to seem like you know a lot, you just start saying SOPs, VOPs, DOPs, and make some stuff about particles, and everyone will think you're really smart. So I started to play around a little bit more with different SOPs, surface operators, and there's some really interesting ones. This kind of, the first one, Copy, reminded me of the cloner in Cinema 4D. There was a lot of similarities between Cinema 4D and Houdini that I was starting to see. I just realized, for one, Houdini can respond so much faster to volume building and geometry than Cinema 4D. Also, Houdini lets you manipulate geometry on a point level. You can specifically select certain points of geometry and decide what to do with them, versus Cinema 4D kind of covers all that up with its layer manager and doesn't really let you dive in like Houdini. And as nice as that sounds, and it is ultimately a good thing, it does add this whole nother layer of being overwhelmed by all types of new buttons, operations, Vex code. There's really a lot to dive into once you actually dive in. And for now, I decided I'm just going to kind of ignore all that and mostly just stay in the SOPs context and not dive too deep into Vex. Ugh. So day 2, I started off with a bunch of misplaced confidence and thought I could start off by tackling a intermediate YouTube tutorial, and actually I got pretty far and understood quite a bit, and in the end I did learn a lot. Even though the tutorial was older, I think they were using like Houdini 16.5 or 17. I'm on 18.5. And there's one node in their tutorial that didn't transfer, and I actually figured out how to do a workaround, but ended up tearing my geometry more, and I didn't get a nice, beautiful rendered result like I wanted to. But I did learn a lot, and I liked the video a lot too. They have some really good stuff. You should definitely check them out if you're in the same kind of boat as me, trying to learn Houdini from scratch. This is really cool. You can see on the screen that you can actually like see the normal direction, and you can see you can grow like noise based off your normal. This is where I really started to get hooked on Houdini, because to me this reminded me of shading inside of Octane and Redshift, and I absolutely love shading. Shading and lighting are like my favorite things in CG, and the fact that this kind of workflow had that option, like I didn't realize, yeah, it's node based like shading, but you can actually like build your geometry like you would build a shader. That's when I got hooked. This is like the tutorial. I was like, okay, yeah, this is definitely gonna work. Like I'm gonna go through with these 7 days. Something else pretty interesting that I learned on this day is that you can like directly manipulate the Houdini interface. I kind of talked about earlier how you can like inject code into certain parameters, but like in this you can like add in float sliders, you can add in switches, you can add in basically like any type of Boolean code, float, integer. You can take that, add it in as your own parameter, and then copy that parameter attribute and paste it into other parameter attributes across the program. You could actually make your own tools, your own interfaces, design it from scratch for stuff that you're doing over and over again, which is really nice. This is definitely going to save me a lot of time in the future, and I actually already did this on the 7th day. When we get to it, you see I created an asteroid generator from scratch, and I had all these different parameters on my custom user interface that I can control. Instead of having to dive deep into the SOP network, I could just slide a few sliders and generate a new asteroid, which is really awesome. So something I actually do want to talk about briefly is you'll see this little solver node in the SOP network. It kind of looks like a little brain. This node is really cool. It allows you to reference your previous frame and modify your geometry based on the previous frame, which means you can create like growing networks or even simulations, which that is definitely something I'm probably going to dive into in the next 30 days is the solver node. That one really stuck with me. Okay, here we go, day 3. Day 2 was mostly spent on SOPs. I decided to spend day 3 on POPs, or POP. So what is a POP? Well, basically a POP is a node that is generating particles from geometry, often referencing a SOP. So I did learn them in order by accident, but still, that's good. I've said this before, but the way Houdini is moving information around, what's happening under the hood of the program is so unlike any other program. It seems like, and I know you are, you're referencing code almost, and sometimes you're able to like bring that code from like deep within the program, reference it real quick, and then modify it, and then push it back down into the network, which might sound a little confusing and boring, but when you think about it, it allows you to create very interesting results. You can create art based off of algorithms if that's something that you want to do. You can leverage math in a way that helps you work faster, which is not really available in Blender or Cinema 4D. So day 4 is the first day I kind of decided I wasn't going to play around and just try to learn a thing. I was going to actually make something. So I started day 4 off by building an asteroid, and I wanted to create a procedurally generated asteroid node system inside of Houdini, which I didn't end up doing this day. I actually ended up scrapping everything you're seeing right here. But this really set me up to fully understanding and implementing SOPs, especially like the Boolean modifier, which was really cool, or copy to points, which is a very interesting version of like the Octane scattering is the best way I could describe it. And this is the day where I was actually, this is the farthest I've ever gone consecutively using Houdini, and this is the day I decided, like, this program could possibly be for me. Like, I think I'm at the point in my career as an artist where I'm ready to take on a challenge like learning this program. That all being said, you can see I'm running into a lot of problems right here. Actually running into a big meshing issue, and I don't really have a big background in 3D modeling. I have very little actually, and typology is something I really need to work on and understand. What I ended up figuring out was that the Boolean modifier had introduced different resolutions of mesh into my geometry, and that was what was messing up my soft peak SOP. So I ended up remeshing it. Still did not look exactly how I wanted it. I did get some pretty interesting looks, but in the end, I found another workaround for all of this. Brings us to day 5. Day 5 is essentially the same as day 4, except I had to rebuild everything to get the proper meshing workflow, and you'll see I actually figured out how to do that. Converting polygons into VBDs is what I ended up doing. Right here you see I also took a little bit of a different approach with the Boolean modifier. I added in a torus to kind of cut a hole through the object. I thought that would look a little bit cooler. You can see right there I just had converted polygons to a VBD, and then what that allows me to do is apply certain types of cloud noises and expand the geometry using the Houdini noise algorithms for specifically clouds, and it kind of just gives you a different look, a little bit more organic, some people would say. Then after that, what I did is I remeshed it back into polygons, and then I subtracted more from the geometry, this time smaller craters, and this is just adding variation to the surface, and you can see a bunch of the craters are a bunch of different sizes. I found this very important, especially when like referencing real life asteroids. You do not want a bunch of craters the same size. That will just give it away as not realistic. Also, I did end up implementing this interesting workflow to where you're only scattering or you're only subtracting big craters from the surface. So I thought that was nice. And another thing is I did end up changing the torus right here and adding mountain noise to the torus. This is something nice about Houdini, is like I already did a Boolean operation on this torus, but I just have to scroll up the node network and I can modify that torus and everything will update down the network, which is it goes without saying for this program, but it is very procedural, and this allows for rapid iterations, and you're not scared to make iterations. Sometimes I'm scared to make iterations inside of Cinema 4D or Blender because I fear about having to rebuild everything again, and I don't necessarily know if the result's not going to be there or not. In Houdini, I just copy a network, or I just switch it real quick, and there you go. So basically right around here I started finalizing my base mesh, and I decided I wanted to get a little bit more advanced in quote-unquote procedural, and I thought I'd make two different noises, one noise for the surface and then another noise for the craters, because looking at references I noticed that the craters were smoother than the surface. And something really cool that I figured out you could do is take the ambient occlusion and then use that to mix the two noises together. And this reminded me a bunch of shading, and like I said guys, I love shading, so when I figured out I can just implement an ambient occlusion node and automatically modify my geometry, I don't have to wait to do it with a bump map later on, I got really excited. And that's definitely something I'm going to remember to do in the future, is take into account that ambient occlusion, because you can just modify your geometry however you want. So from here on forward, you can see I'm spending just most of my time cleaning up the geometry and adding that last kind of final bit of details. The base shape, the distribution of noise, everything is kind of where I want it to be. Now it's just cleaning everything up. And something that was pretty interesting that I figured out you could do is clean up geometry with the for loop. So basically, by targeting the volume attribute, you can tell the for loop for anything that is less than a certain volume, delete. And that's exactly what I ended up doing using the blast node, which is a very interesting node. Now, this is the really cool part. Inside of Houdini, you can actually create your own user interface using parameters such as float values or Boolean values or switches. So I actually ended up doing that. I ended up creating a subnet, and then after I create that subnet, I'm then able to add different parameters to it. So for example, if I want to change the noise on the mountain, on all the mount nodes, instead of going to each node, I can just create a float value for that mount node on the master of the subnet and then link that float number to all of the other float numbers. And you can see me doing this right here. I ended up doing not the best job of it. Next time I build something like this, I'm definitely going to be more organized about it. Also, if you don't have any background understanding of programming, this can be a little complicated at first. You just need to remember the difference between floats, integers, booleans. They all have different meanings in the programming language context. For example, floats can have decimal places, but integers cannot. So that's something pretty important to consider. If you make an integer value and you want to have fine tuning of it, you're going to have to use a float instead. And you want to make sure you're matching up integers to integers and floats to floats, or else you could get pretty messy. But this is something I definitely appreciate about Houdini, is the level of control and customization you have, not only over your networks, but over your user interface and building that out. You can literally, you're kind of just building your own plugin essentially just inside of Houdini, which is really nice. And it allows for a lot of creative expression of not only your ideas, but also the way you tackle your workflow, because you're able to design and build your own interface custom to however you want it to look like, so it can serve your exact purpose that you need. So this brings us to day 6. So I had finally finished the asteroid generator and it was where I wanted it to be, but now I wanted to kind of show off the asteroids, and I thought a cool, interesting way would be to morph between them all. However, I only ended up figuring out how to morph between 2 objects. I don't know how to morph between 3 or more, but still the idea was you'd be able to show the asteroid and it morphing between all of the different ones, and as it changes, the material's procedural, so the material like evolves with the asteroid as well. I started off by trying to do a copy to points. I also thought I could use this copy to points attribute in like a creative way to help with the animation. However, I figured out pretty fast that the easier way would be to do a volume convert node. So convert the polygons into VBD and then use a solver, which again, the solver is a really cool node. We'll actually be using the solver to mesh over time the volume essentially. So we'll take 2 geometries, use the solver, and then mesh between the 2. Now, this did end up being pretty like system intensive because you had to mesh at such a high voxel resolution. If you're meshing at a lower voxel resolution, it's not as bad. It's actually really fast. Even with the solver, though, it slowed down a little bit. And the solver is interesting because what you're doing is you're referencing your previous frame, so you don't have to redo the calculation. I did try to do it without the solver at first. In the first like 30 frames shot by fast, but after that it exponentially got harder. Every single frame that I'd take by, it'd slow more and more down. So really, if you're going to do something like this, the solver is the only way to go. Once I kind of built everything out in that aspect, I was mostly just trying to find a nice balance between detail and animation time. You can see I'm playing a lot around with animation time. Animation is something that I don't have a huge background in. I have done motion graphics and different things like that, but I've always been interested in lighting and rendering and looks. And speaking of lighting and rendering, I'm taking it into Cinema 4D, and I'm actually using one of my own custom materials. You can see it took me a long time to get the lighting and everything and the exact look I wanted to go for. I wasn't sure how I wanted to present this asteroid. I could go for a wide variety of looks. I could go for abstract look. I could go for like this gold look, which is kind of what I ended up going for. But right now I'm testing out some of the materials, some of my custom materials that I will be releasing eventually, but they're not even close yet. I really want these materials to be special, so they're not, don't ask about them, they're not out yet. Maybe like in a few months, probably longer though, honestly. But yeah, we're basically, what I'm doing here is just using one of my custom procedural materials, and now just trying to like create an interesting composition to show off the morph of the asteroid. And one thing I did end up running to, which was a big problem, was so I exported the asteroid already spinning out of Houdini because I thought it'd be, just good practice. And this is an Alembic file, so an ABC file. And since this texture is procedural, I am doing a box projection. And on some of my test animations, I figured out that if you're doing a box projection, you can see that right here. This is where I'm like finding out the issue. If you're doing a box projection on a Alembic file, if the limbic file is translating in any way, that box projection is going to stay the same. It's not going to rotate with the limbic file. So if you're planning on rotating or doing like any kind of rotation slash like translation, just make sure like when you're doing your box projection that it's going to work with that if you're using a procedural material. If you have UVs and created UVs, then you don't have to worry about that. But I did end up fixing it, and now you can see I'm really just cleaning up the scene, trying to check for noise, what kind of sample rate can I get away with, and still have a nice clean render. And then after that, it's to the export.